Alrighty, so the next thing I wanted to show you is something that I found to be very helpful when I was starting out knitting with double-pointed knitting needles. Personally, I much prefer it. I think I've said that before, is that I prefer to knit with double-pointed knitting needles. I find it's much more continuous. So learning to knit on a circular knitting needle is very handy to know, but not extremely useful for the constant day-to-day of knitting. So I wanted to show you how I started out knitting on circular or on double-pointed knitting needles like these. These ones are actually plastic. They look a little bit like metal, but you can, if you feel them, they're actually a lot warmer and quite a bit less slippery. So if you can find something like this is a really great medium, because bamboo can sometimes be troublesome when you get knitting, and they become almost too sticky to work with. And metal ones, you really do lose a lot more stitches, especially in the beginning. So plastic is a really great one to start out with. So what I usually do is I'll take my first knitting needle and I'll put my first cast on stitch, well, my first stitch on there, and tug it up and cast on. I'll just cast on a few stitches per needle. Now this is just like casting on a straight needle, right? You can kind of see how that's pretty much how you would probably do it yourself, unless you have different cast on techniques. Otherwise you would do your own cast on techniques, and it works just fine on circulars as well. So I've got 2, 4, 5 stitches on here. Now the next part is the part that's going to be confusing and frustrating and aggravating, especially on metal knitting needles. But I always find it's very helpful to lay it down on a piece like a pillow on your lap or something like this. So I've brought up a pillow. So now here I've laid down the first needle, and I take my second needle and kind of just lay it on top. Just lay it on top, and pulling this from underneath, I can pull this working thread here. So here's my end thread. Pull the working thread. Now lift them both up just above the pillow. So you kind of have that cushion. You can lay it down if you get confused. Now carry on casting on, holding the needles side by side, like completely side by side. You can see there's just enough room for the yarn to fit next to it. Now you carry on casting on. So now it seems a lot more like you're just adding on more stitches onto a straight knitting needle. And it's just a line. And you carry on kind of the same way, grabbing a third knitting needle and just lining it up next to the other two, and continue casting on. The closer they are together, the less chance you'll lose stitches and lose knitting needles. So now I've got 5 on all 3 of my knitting needles, and I keep the 4th for joining work. You always need an extra knitting needle when you're working on double-pointed knitting needles. So now here comes a really confusing part that I frequently do backwards, is you need to join this working yarn to your end yarn, just like any other circular knitting. You need to find a way to join. Now you need your end yarn in your left hand if you're a right-handed knitter. I don't know how left-handed knitters do it, but so basically turn the whole work, keeping everything kind of in the exact same direction it is. Now this helps as well with the keeping all of your bottoms together. Just like I mentioned with the working on circulars, you have to keep all of your stitches facing the same direction. So this really helps doing it this way with them lined up right next to each other. So you can see that's on the bottom there. So now I've got my end yarn on the left and my working yarn on the right, just like it should be. So the next step is kind of a motion of trust. You have to know that those stitches aren't just going to fall apart, and if you've cast them on tightly enough, they should be okay. But if you lay them down, you'll know for sure. So now I've got all of my bottoms up, and I can lift the first one over and the second one over, making sure that all of my bottoms are kind of facing towards the middle now. I'll move this extra needle out of the way. I'm just kind of bringing them a little bit closer together so that I can actually start my join. Now, I'm not going to knit these two needles together because I have my extra needle. So all I need is just for this yarn to come around. So now all of my bottoms are in the middle here, and here's my working yarn, and here's my end yarn. My end yarn I'll put underneath here so that it's out of the way, and I'll take my first cast on stitches rather, and push them to the very end, just like you would with the beginning of a new needle. Now insert your extra needle, your empty needle, into the very first cast on stitch, and wrap the working yarn around it just like you would with regular knitting. So this is essentially just a knit stitch. And you pull it off just like you normally would, and you carry on knitting. Now at this point, because things are still quite loose on your needles, you'll want to make sure that you're knitting right above the pillow so that you can lay the needles down when you need to, and that you can just let them rest so that they can find their tops and their bottoms. Now this kind of looks a lot like a jumbled mess, and you'll see as I finish up the first round, you'll start to see that something is forming. But at this point it's very confusing, and I can understand how it's very frustrating. It was very frustrating for me beginning as well. Now normally I do a continental style knitting, which is with my left hand, but with the first row on double pointed knitting needles I frequently revert to cast knitting, English style cast knitting. So I always find it's just easier to stay on task and know what's what. So you can kind of start to see the first row of knitting forming on that first needle. So now that I've done the last stitch on that needle, I'll push it to the middle, and I'll take this next needle, oops, this is in the way. So now I've got my bottoms all in the middle here, and I just start knitting with this one. Now I'm kind of trusting that these stitches aren't just going to fall right off, but if I get confused I can just lay them down, and there's my circle. And here's my working yarn, and I carry on. One, two, three, four. And you can see here too that as I'm doing it, the other two needles are flopping around a little bit, and that's really disconcerting, I know. But really it's key to keep in mind that it's just the two needles that you're currently working with that you really have to worry about, aside from feeling the other needles slipping out. But if they bang around a little bit, if they wobble a little bit, that's okay. Just keep focused on where your stitches are and where your working yarn is. So there we've got two needles with finished stitches on them. We'll pick up the third needle here. And you can see how I'm just knitting with the two needles that I'm working with, almost as if I'm doing straight knitting. It's almost as if I'm ignoring the other two, kind of just flopping around. But I can feel now, even at the beginning or at the end of the first row, that the stitches are a little bit more secure on those needles. Once you get one row in, you're already a little bit less nervous about them falling off the needles. And once you get to third, fourth, fifth row, and anything after that, really, there's not a lot you'll have to worry about. Just like I was showing you before with the knitting needles, I wasn't worried about stitches falling off. Now at the end of this, you can see that there's a little bit of extra string. And really, that's one thing that does drive me a little bit nuts, is that you have to make sure that as you're stitching, every time you grab a new needle, Every time you grab the next double point and you push it to the end, you really have to make sure that this stitch here, this very first stitch on this row, is good and snug. So you can see that there's 3 needle tips in here, but I'm ignoring this one because it's the last needle. I'll just wrap it around like normal, but just make sure that it's nice and tight so that you don't get too many gaps between your needles in the finished work. So otherwise you'll be able to count how many needles were used for each circular knitting project. So I think you can kind of start to see the circle forming. There's 2 rows on that part, and you can see that it's sort of starting to form that tube that is so synonymous with knitting in the round. I'm going to go ahead and revert to Continental. It's because it's a little faster and you'll be able to see a little better as it's forming. Just ignore these ones. Now I'm only on the 2nd row, but really I know that these stitches are pretty secure by this point, especially because I know what I'm working with. I know my needles and I know how sticky they are. If you find that your needles are too slippery and they really are losing a lot of stitches, you might want to take it slow the first few rows and stay close to your pillow to make sure that your needles can stay flat again, so you can find your circle. But chances are also good that you have some sticky needles in your supply somewhere that you can go ahead and start out with, so that by the 2nd row you can just lift the whole thing off and not worry about losing stitches and losing needles. See, now I'm starting the 3rd row already, and that's just whizzing along. Just new needle to the top, stitch, 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 new needle to the top. There we go. And now this looks nearly as far as the little green one that I showed you earlier. So there's your knitting in the round on double pointed needles. Now, if there's anything that was too fast or whatever, please put it in the comments, and I can definitely try and redo to show you again, because it is very much something that you'd want to watch a few times over to make sure that you are getting it with the video. So we've covered a lot of topics on circular knitting, and I hope that this series has been helpful. If you have any other questions, or if there was something that wasn't very clear, or the view of the videos wasn't the right angle, I'd really love to hear back some feedback in the comments or whatever. Just let me know what you'd like to see, if there's anything else you wanted to know about or to have clarified maybe a little better, because this is my first time doing video series, and yeah, I don't always know what the viewers would want. So let me know your feedback in the comments below.